Okay, thanks for joining us. If you want to just see videos of the monuments, you can go straight pretty much to minute 57. That's just film of the monuments, complete with traffic background, no narration. The first 21 minutes is pretty much political background. Between minute 21 and minute 57 is pretty much biographical data on the individuals represented by these statues. At minute 110 and thereafter is the summary. Okay, this is September the 7th, 2021. Doing this video because it is looking after much litigation and much controversy that the Lee Monument on Monument Avenue in Richmond, Virginia is going to be removed this week. So this is sort of like my attempt to sort of gather some video and pictures of the monuments and what they were like for posterity, and maybe to correct a few things and maybe to elaborate on a few things. Let me be crystal clear, this is not a video that's designed to extol the virtues of white supremacy. We're all better off that the North won the Civil War and that slavery has been abolished. Equal protection of the law is the law of the land, as it should be. Slavery was awful. You had people, slaves, lynched. You had mothers separated from their children. You had floggings, horrific set of circumstances. Anybody who is subjected to slavery undoubtedly suffered greatly, just the humiliation, even if you had a kind master. So that is not the purpose of this, to try to extol the virtues of the Southern cause, merely to maybe sometimes point out a few things that are sometimes overlooked, and also to give everybody a little bit of an appreciation of what these monuments and statues meant to the people of the city of Richmond, and probably, frankly, to the South, and to the tourists, even Northerners who enjoyed visiting the battlefields, for example, in Virginia. Okay, so this is the preliminary to the preliminary. Let me just say this. We're getting further and further removed from the Civil War. As time has gone on, today's youth, the folks and the young adults coming through the ranks, so to speak, don't have the connection to the history of the Civil War that folks, say, of my generation do, and I'm older than 60. When I was a little kid, we had Civil War toys, Yankees versus Rebels toy soldiers. We had toy guns that were from the Civil War, the movies. You would see there's the John Wayne film with Rock Hudson. I think it's Rio Bravo or something, where you see after the war the Yankees and the rebel soldiers actually getting along, even though there was some rivalry. There was this TV show called Johnny Yuma, who was a rebel, and he was the good guy, but it was post-war. But there's also this video somewhere, and I think it's even on YouTube, of President Eisenhower while he was in office. There was some discussion about the North-South thing or something like this. And Eisenhower just stopped everything, and he said, I got pictures of 3 people in my office in the White House. One is Abraham Lincoln, one is George Washington, and the other is Robert E. Lee. So, part of this thing about the Northerners allowing the Southerners to put up these statues and all this kind of stuff to the Southern cause was part of the healing process. And a part of in order to have healing, you had to have mutual respect for each other's heroes and all that kind of stuff. And this carried over, like, for example, largely even to folks of my generation. So even if you know that slavery is very, very wrong, and even though you know that we're all better off that the Yankees won the war and all that kind of stuff, you still, because they were part of your childhood play, so to speak, and part of the culture, you still develop a fondness for these characters. Now, as time goes on, today's children probably don't have toys that are like we did, and these individuals are less and less important to them. The Civil War is longer and longer ago. And I should just add as a postscript, I say all this having grown up originally in the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania area. So I in my very early youth, am a Yankee. It's as short as I can because I did an earlier video on this, I think back in 2017 or something like that, where I did an extended version of this. It went on for about an hour and 40 some minutes, complete with analysis of McClellan's Peninsula campaign and Grant's Overland campaign, both of which greatly affected the city of Richmond. And so I recommend you to that video for more about all the battles that took place right around the Richmond area, which of course had a great effect on the psychology of the folks in the city of Richmond. That video also talks about when these statues were erected. There was, by some estimates, over 100,000 people in the city of Richmond present for the unveiling of the Lee Monument, which is going to be taken down today. And that was in the early 1900s. And if those figures are correct, that the figure of the people that showed up for that unveiling, that would have been some multiple. That was far greater than the entire population of the city of Richmond. I am not going to get into the important question of the relationship of these gentlemen, or what their relationship with slavery was, or whether they had slaves. That's an important subject, but we would just go on too long here. But I think it's safe to say that virtually all the guys that we're going to talk about here, all the men on these that are represented by these statues, had slaves. So I sort of defer to what your further research reveals in terms of that question. But a couple things, well, several things I think need to be pointed out that are often overlooked when you hear statements in some quarters that basically said these guys were traitors, etc., etc. It's like anytime you try to summarize or you make those types of charges, one has to investigate further to see whether or not they were fair. You have to remember that slavery was around since the beginning of recorded history. It was basically the way of life on this planet right up through the time of the American Civil War. And although it was beginning to be outlawed in more and more places. You have to remember that all races have practiced slavery against other races at one time or another in terms of recorded history. So in a sense, it was just sort of a way of life. We think of, and rightfully so, we think of slavery today as being a horrible thing. But these folks just weren't raised that way. I mean, it was just normal stuff to them. Anyway, and it has to be remembered that Black folks Native Africans aided and abetted white slave traders in capturing other black folks to ship them off to the Americas to be sold into slavery. So blacks were, in fact, complicit in the slave trade during the time in question. So what I'm trying to say is that a lot of times these figures are associated with being for a cause that was anti-black. It's probably more correct to look at it as pro-slavery, because that's what everybody did back in those days, than to say that they were anti-black. I know that that's a tough distinction to make, but it's in many respects an important one, because, like I said, white folks have been enslaved. A lot of folks, especially people like Greeks and what have you in the Mediterranean area, were enslaved by, I believe, the Berbers in northern Africa. Slaves built the pyramids. If you go into Rome, a lot of the Roman ruins and all that kind of stuff were built by slaves. So slavery has been everywhere for a long, long, long time. And you have to remember the U.S. Constitution, when it was ratified in the late 1780s, had this thing called the Three-Fifths Compromise. So in a sense, slavery was built into the U.S. Constitution at the time of the Constitution's adopted and when the Southern states signed on. Briefly, for those who may not know, the Three-Fifths Compromise basically had to do with when the Constitution was being formed. When this country was originally being put together, the Three-Fifths Compromise was a way for the northern states, northern colonies, to convince the southern colonies to join the Union. They agreed that slaves would be counted three-fifths. It had to do with the number of seats you would get in the House of Representatives and how people would be counted for purposes of taxation. And the North did not want slaves to be counted at all. The South wanted every slave to be counted. So the count ended up being agreed upon to be three-fifths. Slaves would be counted as three-fifths of a person. And that was a necessary provision of the original Constitution in the late 1780s for the South to join the Union. And so when to make a long story short, when you had like by the time the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and we're talking 50s, 60s years later, those debates, the Northern position, and, we're talking about the balance of power between pro-slave states and free states, very long history on that. But by the time the Civil War rolled around, it was the North that was trying to change the rules. It wasn't the South that was brave. The South felt like they were having the rules of their originally joining the Union changed on them. And their argument was, look, we didn't join the Union to be told later on, here now, that slavery would be illegal. And that's where this states' rights thing comes in. When they talk about whether it's about states' rights or slavery, the two issues are so intertwined is when you're talking about one, you're talking about the other. In short, the South felt that the North was changing the rules on them, that they would not have joined the Union to begin with if slavery was going to be illegal. I don't want to get into a long discussion of the cause of the Civil War, but in essence, this issue of slavery was always looming in the background for the first 50 or 60 years of this country. And the real problem started because of the admission of free states versus slave states into the Union as the country grew in a westward direction. The southern states were concerned that if there were too many free states that came in, that eventually slavery would be ruled to be illegal. And for the first, especially in the 20 or 30 years immediately prior to the Civil War, there were a series of compromises in Congress that allowed new states to be admitted one by one, depending on whether they were free states or slave states. And that was always a precarious situation. You may want to study the history of Kansas and Missouri, for example, and Nebraska and all those states. But the bottom line was, in the end, when Abraham Lincoln, who was anti-slavery, but even his actions in that regard are very interesting and very nuanced. When Abraham Lincoln was elected president, the South became basically scared to death. This is the last straw. This guy is against slavery. He's spoken out against slavery, and slavery is going to be illegal. The South more or less thought they saw the writing on the wall, and they decided to they voluntarily joined the Union. So that means that we can voluntarily leave the Union, because it looked like Lincoln and those Yankees were going to make slavery illegal because they were getting too much power. And you have to remember that at the start of the Civil War, slavery was not illegal. As a matter of fact, slavery did not arguably become illegal until, the beginning of that was the Emancipation Proclamation, which didn't occur. Lincoln didn't issue it until the Civil War had been going on for a couple of years. And even then, slavery was not made illegal in northern states, such as Maryland, that had not seceded from the Union. And that's an important point. Slavery did not become illegal until after the Civil War. So when the Civil War started, slavery was not illegal. So you have to remember, I think it's safe to assume, for the sake of argument, that all of these figures, on these statues, owned slaves. And like I said, I'll leave it to you to learn more about their relationship with slaves in question. But let's consider, for example, the situation of a plantation owner like Jeff Davis, okay? Well, what are you going to do? I mean, it's been a way of life, and the entire Southern economy depends unfortunately, on slave labor. And here you have these foreigners, these northerners from some other area of the country, who do not have agricultural societies like existed in the South, which was dependent on agriculture, picking cotton and tobacco, et cetera, which relied on slavery. You didn't have a big need for slaves in the more industrialized North with smaller farms. But anyway, Jeff Davis is not going to be in a position to release his slaves unless everybody else in the South releases their slaves, because otherwise his cotton is not going to be picked with a base price that he's going to have to turn around and resell. He's going to have higher production costs, and he would not be able to successfully compete with his neighboring plantation owners if Jeff Davis, for example, decided unilaterally to release free his slaves, and his neighbor does not. And the other thing is about these guys. Now imagine the situation you're in, and Lee clearly exemplified this more than anybody else, but they all face the same problem. Are you going to fight against your area of the country? And we're talking about back when people didn't have television, they didn't have as much freedom of movement. Your friends and family would ostracize you. You would basically be friendless if all of a sudden you were going to go fight for the Union. You're a career military man, and these guys were career military men. As a matter of fact, they weren't traitors in the sense that they had put their lives on all of them previously during the Mexican-American War when they fought for the United States of America. And anyway, so when their homeland decides to try to secede for the Union, what choice do any of these guys really have? They're military men to begin with. are you going to give up friends and family? Are you going to torch and level the earth just like Sherman did to your own friends and neighbors? Uh, no, their situation was, they were forced into basically a grisly Hobson's choice, and their decision making should be viewed in that context. Now, like I said, this is not a pro-slavery. It's not an anti-black video. That's not the purpose here. Um, uh, but basically, it is an attempt to basically show the monuments as they were for the people that enjoyed those monuments, and also to present facts that seem to get lost. I will just also say I lived in the city of Richmond for a number of years, and I did not encounter the rancor over those monuments that one sort of thinks must have existed here. Now, I lived in the fan. In fact, I lived right next door to the Lee Monument. Now, could I be wrong? And maybe were my black neighbors talking about those monuments behind my back? I guess there probably was some of that. I'd probably be sort of naive to think that there wasn't a little bit, but I just did not see the rancor. Um, and I will also say what was amazing to me about all that was the population of the city of Richmond was predominantly black, and the black representatives controlled city council. Now, in my earlier videos, I was incorrect about something because I never really truly understood this until after I made the first video. Shame on me, but I never did understand this, and that was that, number one, that the Commonwealth of Virginia, the state, and not the city of Richmond, controlled the Lee Monument. And the situation was similar with respect to the other monuments, but there were nuances there about state control over those monuments and not city control that I did not fully comprehend to begin with when I did the last video. And so it makes why this didn't occur previously make a little bit more sense, because in the last 10 years or so, the legislature in the city in the Commonwealth of Virginia has changed, and there was increasing turnover of control of those statues to the city of Richmond. But also the other thing is that all these events here in the city of Richmond, nobody's done a study on this, but I would be personally very curious as to how much it was caused by outsiders. Clearly, the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis and the right-wing protests up in Charlottesville both had a big effect on the ultimate demise of these statues in the city of Richmond, which went to my thesis in the earlier videos, that a lot of this is being caused by outside forces and not within the city of Richmond, but all of that is admittedly subject to debate.
Project more or less more from a mere picture-taking exercise on my part into this video. It sort of grew and grew and grew. And in a second, we're going to show some pictures and videos of the monuments. Hopefully, you'll appreciate the aesthetic values of those monuments. But naturally, they are a source of considerable controversy, given events in Charlottesville and in Baltimore and in St. Louis and a few other places. Okay, here comes. This is a statue to one of those legends of the Confederacy, Stonewall Jackson, Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson. He went to West Point. He served in the U.S. Army during the Mexican War. Where have you heard that before? He taught at VMI, Virginia Military Institute. He was a brigade commander at 1st Manassas, otherwise known, Manassas is also known as Bull Run, where there was 2 battles there. And at the very first one, he got his nickname, Stonewall, after arriving with reinforcements to help turn the tide of battle. I don't know, I think I'm paraphrasing, but the saying, there was Bernard B., I think, was a general, and the Confederates were a little bit stressed or pressed during the battle, and another Confederate general said, look, there stands Jackson like a stone wall, rally behind the Virginians. And that's how Jackson got his name. That may not be an exact quote, but it's pretty close to what was said. Oh, here it is. There is Jackson standing like a stone wall. Let us determine to die here and we will conquer. Rally behind the Virginians. There you go. All right. So, Jackson is thought of as some kind of military genius, and he was known for his successful Shenandoah Valley campaign early in the war, very early in the war, where he defeated 3 separate Union armies up and down the Shenandoah Valley. After the Peninsula campaign, when he came down to Richmond to help Lee during the Peninsula campaign, Lee reorganized the army and gave Jackson command of the 2nd Corps. When Lee took command in 1862, he reorganized the Confederate Army at that time into 2 corps, later 3. The 1st Corps he gave to James Longstreet. Many consider Stonewall Jackson to be Lee's right-hand man before Jackson was killed in 1863, and he looked upon him, and many look upon Jackson as sort of a military genius. He believed in keeping the enemy off guard. He believed that once the enemy was in retreat, you followed until you crushed him and destroyed him. Never let the enemy have enough time to prepare fully to fight you, was sort of what he believed in. And his troops were known as the foot cavalry because they could travel long distances, even though since they were infantry, they weren't cavalry. His foot cavalry was not cavalry at all. It was infantry troops that were famous for being able to do quick, long marches, and this constantly kept the Union Army off balance. So Jackson is viewed as some sort of military genius, and he's still studied today, from what I understand. He was involved in the capture of Harper's Ferry by Confederate troops, and he played a crucial role, if not decisive role, in winning the Battle of Chancellorsville. And it was there, when he was out scouting enemy positions, that he was accidentally shot by his own troops, and later died. They had to amputate his arm before he died. And actually, I think I saw a picture of his arm, believe it or not. Somebody actually took a picture. Anyway, I won't go there. But anyway, he, I think what's the name of the place? Guinea Station. It's out there. It's near Thornburg. It's about 3 or 4 miles away from Thornburg is where he died. The house is still there. You can go in there and visit. Back then, remember, they didn't have anesthesia and all that stuff. So that was just a horrific operation to go through, an amputation back in those days. Interestingly enough, Jackson was a very religious man who I didn't have enough time to confirm this, but I think he would refuse to fight on Sundays. I think that's the case. I'm not sure. Anyway, he also, I believe, died on a Sunday, which he said he always wanted to do, which was die on Sunday. Like I said, he was a very religious man. He has some, for those who want to study him further, he's got some interesting quotes. And his last words were, "Let us cross over the river and rest under the shade of the trees." It's kind of poetic. But in any event, Stonewall Jackson, a true legend. Okay, this is J.E.B. Stuart. And J.E.B. Stuart is a sort of a dashing character. Well, I should say character. He was the Cavalry Corps commander for the Confederate Army. But he does cut a dashing figure, and as you can see that in the statue here. He was born in 1822, and he attended Emory and Henry College before attending West Point. Like Lee, he served, and Jefferson Davis for that matter, he served in the U.S. military before the Civil War. As a matter of fact, he first met Robert E. Lee when Lee was the superintendent at West Point and Stuart was a student. Jeb Stuart fought in the Indian Wars in Bleeding, Kansas, which of course was a slavery conflict in the Kansas, Missouri area immediately prior to the war, and he also participated and was an important actor in the capture of John Brown at Harper's Ferry. He resigned from the U.S. military like Lee did when the conflict between the states became apparent, and he joined the Confederate Army. Originally, he was serving under Stonewall Jackson, which would have been up in the valley, the Shenandoah Valley campaign, and later he became Lee's famous eyes and ears as he eventually was placed by Lee in charge of the Confederate Cavalry Corps. He was known as a dashing and daring cavalry commander, of course, and twice led very famous reconnaissance expeditions where his cavalry rode totally around the Union Army, once during the Peninsula campaign and another time at Antietam.
Yeah, it's important to note that Jeb Stuart actually was Stonewall Jackson's replacement at the important Battle of Chancellorsville when Jackson was accidentally shot by his own troops. It was Stuart who was put in charge of the entire Second Corps. And prior to that, Stuart had been part of Jackson's famous flanking maneuver that helped secure the important Confederate victory, one of its biggest victories at the Battle of Chancellorsville. But it was actually Stuart who actually finished that battle on Stonewall Jackson's behalf, becoming the temporary commander of the Second Corps.
However, on another occasion, one of his missions, he got sidetracked up in Pennsylvania, and although he did capture some considerable supplies, his being out and away from Lee during the lead up to the Battle of Gettysburg has been criticized, and many argue that it may have cost Lee some valuable reconnaissance prior to the start of the Battle of Gettysburg. That's a controversial point. But like I said, it wasn't like he was totally wasting his time when he did that. He did capture some things. He got as far north as Harrisburg, PA during that ride. And in any event, that's a source of debate. All right. During Grant's Overland campaign, after, I guess this would have been after the Wilderness and Spotsylvania Courthouse, immediately thereafter in early May of 1864, Sheridan was going to sort of go on a raid attacking the northern extremities of the city of Richmond. Stuart came south to head him off, and there was a battle at a place called Yellow Tavern, and unfortunately for Stuart, he was wounded in that battle. Incidentally, I believe that George Custer participated in that battle, and that battle was right where the intersection of I-295 and Interstate 95 are, about 7 or 8 miles north of downtown Richmond. Stuart was seriously wounded but died the next day from his wounds in Richmond. That was on May the 12th, 1864. Okay, this is kind of the forgotten character. Well, I shouldn't say character. The forgotten statue on Monument Avenue. But this guy had actually a lot of positive, profound effect on back in those days commerce and life for everyone, because he sort of dedicated his life to understanding ocean currents and the wind. And so some of his work and studies were used by sailors, and his works actually improved seafaring commerce in the later 1800s. This is Matthew Fontaine Maury, born in 1806 and he died in 1872. He's known as the Pathfinder of the Seas, originally of the U.S. Navy, but Maury's seagoing days were shortened by he broke his leg before the Civil War. He, however, is best known internationally for very important publications work he did in the field of navigation of the seas. He's particularly interested in wind patterns and ocean currents. The product of his work was international recognition, publication in 1847 of Wind and Current Chart of the North Atlantic. This assisted sailors in reducing the time for ocean-going voyages, which enhanced commerce. His study of currents and winds led him to believe that, at least at times, there was a navigable Northwest Passage in areas near the Arctic Circle that were not totally blocked by ice. And in fact, that is true today. We can have this argument, I guess, about global warming or not, but it appears now that there is a navigable Northwest Passage. He advocated international cooperation in matters relating to the study of weather and the oceans, and it had much to do with getting many nations, sometimes even enemies, to share basic data regarding weather and currents. He did much that led to the establishment of the U.S. Naval Observatory. Maury had a long and very distinguished career. He was widely respected. While he did resign his naval commission and join the Confederacy at the start of the war, he was in charge when he was with the Confederacy. He was chief of Seacoast, River, and Harbor Defenses. However, he spent a lot of time trying to talk foreign powers into exercising some influence to try to stop the war. He did develop a mine to be used against Union shipping and did a lot of work abroad trying to obtain ships for the Confederacy. After the Civil War, Maury was offered many distinguished academic positions, but he became a physics professor at VMI. There's a whole lot more about Maury, who led a fascinating life for those who are interested. Okay, and here, this is kind of a spectacular and sort of a complicated monument. It's quite impressive, and it's replete with a lot of what Jefferson Davis had to say, some quotes from some of his speeches. But Jefferson Davis is a very interesting character. He was a former plantation owner, but he had a sort of a sterling resume prior to the outbreak of hostilities. He was a graduate of West Point, interestingly enough. He served in the U.S. Army and fought during the Mexican-American War, where he led a successful charge in the Battle of Monterey, and he was later wounded in the Mexican-American War. He was from Mississippi. He was a Democrat who served in the U.S. Senate before the Civil War. And after that, he again served in the U.S. government when he became Secretary of War in the Franklin Pierce administration, and then he returned to the U.S. Senate. He always believed strongly in states' rights and in their inherent power to leave the Union, secede or withdraw from the United States if a state wanted to do so. After the Civil War, he was imprisoned for a while and indicted for treason. However, he was pardoned by Andrew Johnson, I believe, in 1868. He also ultimately did serve after the war as president of an insurance company and wrote some books, and he died in 1889. Like I said, he was a plantation owner.
And of course, Jefferson Davis was the leader of the Southern cause. He was the president of the Confederate States of America.
Sure, I can get it. Okay, so here we have Robert E. Lee, and trying to encapsulate or briefly describe in a few words the life of any person is presumptuous and futile, but to me at least this is particularly true of Lee, especially in a contentious context like this one is. To me at least, to get an idea of Lee, you just have to look at a photo of him, and he sort of looks, to me at least, that like a trusted uncle. Jeff Davis and Southern soldiers must have been similarly impressed because they certainly did a lot of hard fighting for them, and I think he always held the respect of his troops. He is probably the closest thing there is to a canonized Southern saint in the eyes of many white Southerners. He attended West Point, where he graduated second in his class. He fought in the Mexican-American War. Where did you hear that before? It seems like all these guys did that. He captured John Brown at Harper's Ferry before the war, when John Brown tried to sort of start an insurrection by capturing the arsenal at Harper's Ferry, and he was going to start an anti-slave movement up there. But Lee became commandant of West Point later on, and while he was commandant is when he first met Jeb Stuart. He was offered command of Union forces when it appeared that hostilities would break out with the South, but he turned it down, not wanting to make war on his native Virginia. He became a military advisor to Jeff Davis. At the beginning of the war, he was not immediately put in charge of the Confederate Army. Some people think that was the case, but that's not true. He didn't become commander of Confederate forces initially in the Eastern Theater until the Battle of Seven Pines, which we'll discuss in another part of this video. But after the Battle of Seven Pines, when Joe Johnston was wounded, he was given command of Confederate forces in the East, and later he was pretty much calling all the shots. But let's see here. After the Peninsula Campaign of 1862, he reorganized the army in the Eastern Theater, which is basically southeast United States. Not, I'm excluding Western Tennessee and Mississippi and those areas. That was the Western Theater. After the Peninsula Campaign in 1862, he reorganized the Army, the Confederate Army, into two corps, First Corps and Second Corps. He gave Longstreet the First Corps, put Stonewall Jackson in charge of the Second Corps. Later, he created a Third Corps, which was later commanded by A.P. Hill. Now, Hill doesn't have a monument on Monument Avenue. He is over on Laburnum, and I think Hermitage, roads. But, and unfortunately for Hill, he was killed 1 week before the end of the war during the siege of Petersburg. And unlike these other monuments, which are not burial plots, A.P. Hill is actually buried in his monument, and I think he's buried standing up. But anyway, that's another story. Anyway, back to Lee now. Lee successfully defended Richmond from McClellan's Peninsula Campaign in 1862. He beat Union Generals Pope, Burnside, and Hooker at 2nd Manassas, Fredericksburg, and Chancellorsville, respectively. He was actually able to take an arguably inferior Confederate army north and take the fight to the Union. He took the fight up to Maryland and then later to Pennsylvania. But unfortunately for him and the Confederate cause, he lost at Gettysburg and at Antietam. He fought a series of hotly contested bloody battles against future President Ulysses S. Grant during the 1864 Overland Campaign, which we will discuss later in Northern Virginia. He beat Grant at Cold Harbor, which was actually Lee's last victory, and with his forces depleted because he couldn't replace his forces. The Confederate Army was at that point not very well supplied. It was ill-equipped. Its forces were depleted, so his forces ultimately succumbed and were beaten at the siege of Petersburg by Grant and Union forces. And when Petersburg fell, Richmond could no longer really be supplied, and thereafter Richmond immediately fell, and Lee ultimately had to surrender at Appomattox to Grant, and the war came to a close. Now, it's interesting to note that Lee was not in favor of continuing the war in terms of creating a guerrilla warfare situation where he would retreat into the mountains and take targets of opportunity. He was very much in favor of having the nation heal itself after the war. And he later became president of what is now Washington and Lee College out in Lexington, Virginia, and he died in 1870.
Okay, like I said, in a previous video, I discussed in some detail the military history in the area, the battles that occurred around the city of Richmond. And there were quite a few major battles in the area. You can, there basically was two big periods of conflict around the city of Richmond. One was 1862, and the other one was in 1864. And in both situations, basically what you're talking about is that you had a Union Army within basically 15 miles of the city of Richmond, and the Union Army exceeding 100,000 men, more like somewhere between 110 and 130,000 men. You know, right at the gates of the city of Richmond in 1862 and in 1864. Lee, on the other hand, during these periods, always had a significantly smaller force, usually numbering somewhere between 45 and 60,000, something like that, during the entire period. So he was always very outnumbered. So in other words, I'm trying to give some sense of the threat that the people in the city of Richmond, and of course, when you had the siege of Petersburg, Petersburg is 20 miles south of the city of Richmond, and it was by that point really the biggest and most important means of supplying the city of Richmond, which is why when Petersburg fell, the city of Richmond also fell and precipitated the end of the war. But I get ahead of myself. The 1862 campaign was General McClellan, the Union general, bringing, like I said, about 130,000 troops up from Tidewater, Virginia, basically up from, the Newport News, Williamsburg area, up the peninsula towards the city of Richmond, where he was met initially at the beginning of the war in June by a Confederate force at that time led by Joe Johnston. Johnson at the Battle of Seven Pines, which is right over there at where the airport of the city of Richmond is. We're talking like, again, somewhere 10 miles east of the city of Richmond at this point. Joe Johnston is wounded, and it was at that point in the war that Lee was appointed to take command. And he basically, after things like battles like the 7 Days battles, battles, and several other battles like Malvern Hill, was basically pretty much able to keep the Union Army. Well, he was able to keep the Union Army out of the city of Richmond. And so after 1862, the action basically more or less took place further north, up along mostly along in Spotsylvania County and along the Rappahannock River and Fredericksburg, where Lee and Jackson and Longstreet met a force led by Joe Hooker at the Battle of, Burnsides at the Battle of Fredericksburg, the biggest battle of the war in terms of number of troops involved. I think the Federals had like over 130,000 troops. And once again, the Confederate force under Lee and Jackson and Longstreet had a force about half that size. Anyways, the Confederate force was able to defeat the Federals in Fredericksburg. And it's interesting to note that right after the Battle of Fredericksburg, which is like, we're talking like December of 62, Lee freed his slaves. That's a very complicated subject, but it is interesting to note because it was after one of his major victories and before Lincoln announced the Emancipation Proclamation. So in any event, and then now we're in 1863, and one of the biggest events prior to Gettysburg took place just a few miles from Fredericksburg, the Battle of Chancellorsville, where a huge force under Union General Joseph Hooker met a much smaller Confederate force under Lee and Jackson. In one of the most famous maneuvers in the Civil War, Lee decided to split his forces, and Jackson went around, I believe it was Hooker's right flank. And long story short, the Confederates won a major victory, but unfortunately, Stonewall Jackson was wounded by his own troops in that battle. He was out scouting, and they mistook him for a Union cavalryman, and he was shot accidentally. And a few days later, he died after having to go through having his arm amputated. Very painful process because they didn't have general anesthesia like they do nowadays. You just basically got a big drink of whiskey anyway. So okay, so that was the Battle of Chancellorsville, and then of course Gettysburg took place after that. Lee lost at Gettysburg. He was basically he came back south, and in the ensuing year in 1864, Ulysses S. Grant, having been victorious in the West at Vicksburg, was given command of the entire Union Army, including the Army of the Potomac over here on the East Coast. He undertook command of the Union Army, instituted the Overland, what's known as the Overland Campaign. And he and Lee faced off at first at the Wilderness up in Spotsylvania County, then at the Spotsylvania Courthouse, again in Spotsylvania County. Both of those battles were pretty much a draw, but they were huge battles. And now we're talking about 50 miles north of the city of Richmond here, up near Fredericksburg. But Grant kept trying to get around Lee, and he was able to move south. They faced off again at what's known as the Battle of the North Anna, which is about 30 miles north of the city of Richmond. Then the Battle of Yellow Tavern took place, which is only about 8 miles north of the city of Richmond, between a force led by J.E.B. Stuart and a force led by General Sheridan. And the Federals were able to be victorious. That was a cavalry battle, really. The Federals were able to be victorious, and unfortunately for the Confederates, J.E.B. Stuart was shot, and again he was removed from the battlefield, taken to the city of Richmond, where he died a couple days later. That took away Lee's most important cavalry officer, but after that battle, once again, Grant was unable to extricate Lee from his defensive positions along the North Anna. So Grant once again tried to get around Lee, and they met again over there by the Richmond airport again at what is known as the Battle of Cold Harbor, a massive battle, and Lee was victorious over Grant in that battle. Basically, that was Lee's last victory of the war. But Grant, once again, because the Union Army was much better able to resupply its army with new soldiers and with new weapons. And so Grant was able to sneak across the James River and go down and besiege Petersburg. And this was now leaking into late 1864 and early 1865. And finally, they were able to overcome, after a long siege of several months and a big battle called the Battle of the Crater down there. Grant was finally able to take Petersburg. Lee from there left and tried to escape to the southwest. He abandoned Richmond, could not hold it any longer, so he tried to escape to the southwest towards what is now, I guess, is Lynchburg and Appomattox, and he ultimately was forced to surrender at Appomattox in April of 1865. Anyway, so that's sort of a synopsis. All these major battles: Cold Harbor, Malvern Hill, the Siege of Petersburg, Yellow Tavern, Seven Pines, the 7 Days, and there were several other not insignificant smaller battles that took place during this time. These are all we're talking here about within 15 to 20 miles, eight less, eight, 7, 8, 15 miles of the city of Richmond. Huge um, uh, Union armies. They had bread riots and in the city of Richmond because of inability to supply because the Union controlled the James River. They basically they basically controlled the Tidewater area for most of the war, much of it anyway. So in any event, that gives you a little bit of a historical backdrop. And
Okay, now it should be remembered that the Confederate statues on Monument Avenue were erected 30 to 60 years after the Civil War, so it wasn't these men who directed that they be erected. I guess that goes without saying. But it was the survivors of the wars and one or two generations of their heirs that elected to construct these monuments. Naturally, Arthur Ashe being the exception, he was erected or dedicated in 1996. But Lee, for example, his monument was erected in 1890 to an estimated, when his statue was unveiled, to an estimated crowd of 100,000 people. Now that's a huge number of people by any measure, but it is particularly large when one considers that in 1860, the population of Richmond was right around 40,000 people. Now, by war's end, the estimates are that it had risen considerably to 130 to, I even saw, I think, even 150,000 people. But 100,000 people, that means virtually everybody was there, and then some, really, probably. I would imagine a lot of people, the reason, I don't know, I have no idea, but I would imagine the one reason why the population of Richmond got large towards the end of the war was people out in the farmlands around Richmond were probably looking for protection because there were a considerable number of Union raids in the area, and so they were probably looking for protection. But that of course added to some of the problems that I'm sure that they had in Richmond. For example, they had bread riots, I know, and things of that nature. But things weren't always, certainly with the enemy at the gates, so to speak, situation wasn't always that great in Richmond. Anyway, Stuart was erected. Jeb Stuart was erected in 1907. Stonewall Jackson was erected in 1919. Maury was erected in 1929, and Jeff Davis was also erected in 1907. Like I said, Arthur Ashe was erected or dedicated in 1996, and it's really a tribute to the people in Richmond, their ability to get along, that they could settle on having Arthur Ashe on Monument Avenue along with the Confederate generals. What also needs to be kept in mind is that post-war, the Union occupation of the city was what it was like and the effects thereof. I mean, I'm trying to give you a general idea of what the people of Richmond, what these monuments mean to the people that had them constructed, and what they mean to, the heirs of the people who suffered through the war. The post-war Union occupation of the city, one has to keep that in mind. I'm sure that for a while it was sort of like having an occupation force. And then there's the issue of carpetbagging for those who want to explore what the post-war years were like in Richmond. So people were striving for something to hold on to in terms of their lost cause. But all that's a complicated subject beyond this video. As is discussed in this video, the enemy always seemed to be constantly at the gates of the city of Richmond. Remember the heavy Union troop concentrations that existed in the city of Washington, which is only about 100 miles to the north. Norfolk was eliminated as a port providing supply by May of 1862. And as the war wore on, supplying the city became increasingly difficult, which of course caused hardship for the city of Richmond. For example, like I mentioned, the bread riots in the city of Richmond during the war. For example, but consider this. For example, even when the war was going well, and Lee had pushed the Union forces north and had actually pushed into Maryland and into Pennsylvania about the time of the Battle of Gettysburg. Even during those times, which were the good times, actually that is when they had the bread riots. So even when times were good in the city of Richmond, they weren't. They must have still been pretty bad. So in a sense, removing these statues overlooks the feeling of the citizens of the former era who felt it necessary to give expression to their experiences and their considerable sacrifices during war. And you know, I as part of the video here, I described the Overland campaign and the Peninsula campaign. And lest I forget to mention it, as the war wore on, Petersburg became increasingly important because it was one of the few routes for supplying the city of Richmond with goods. There's a railroad junction down there in Petersburg. And so when Petersburg fell, it basically made holding Richmond and defending Richmond impossible, and it was then that Lee basically left for southwestern Virginia, but he only got to Appomattox before he was basically forced to surrender to Grant. So when Petersburg fell, then Appomattox occurred immediately after that, and you know, the Confederacy pretty much fell. There was some sporadic fighting afterwards. But that was basically the end of the war. That was in April of 1865.
Okay, so in summary, in no way should this video be taken to support slavery. In fact, uh, we very much support equal rights for people of all races to have equal access to employment, to education, you name it. We're all better off because the Union won the Civil War, and the 13th Amendment and the 14th Amendment, for that matter, were both enacted. But history is complicated, and on many levels, it's very unfair to judge historical figures based on contemporary standards. The South was doing what always had been done, and it was the North who, by force of arms, was insisting that the South change its ways uh, um, at the threat of the gun, uh, was the situation that the Southerners found themselves in. So they were basically defending a way of life that had been accepted worldwide since the beginning of history, although that was changing at the time of the war. The northern states were not anywhere near as agrarian as the southern plantation system was. And so the economic systems of the two parts of the country were very different. And it's sort of a little bit unfair for northerners to judge southerners, the character of southerners, or these ancestors, based on a different set of circumstances. Like I said, the original Constitution had the Three-Fifths Compromise, which basically gave tacit recognition to the system of slavery employed by the South. And so, in a sense, and I'm just repeating that it was the North that was changing the rules that were, in a sense, the precondition for the Southern states to join the Union. This constant debate about whether it's a states' rights question or a slavery question is just a false choice, so to speak, because uh, the two issues are so intertwined in this particular context that it's virtually impossible to separate them. Southerners believed that they had a right to withdraw from the United States because the system to join the Union to begin with was voluntary, so they felt like they could voluntarily leave if they didn't like the rules. The problem in this particular context is that the removal of the statues in a very emotionally charged situation in this context everywhere, but in the city of Richmond as well. The problem is that the removal process was tainted by the criminal vandalization of the statues in question, and to a lot of people in the central Virginia area, it just seemed like this was sort of sprung on them by virtue of events that occurred in Minnesota, in Charlottesville, and in other places, not here in Richmond. That may or may not be true, but that is the perception. And it would be very interesting, and this is where the inner cities versus suburban area and the racial divide that occurs there in many instances, what the vote would be if you would take a referendum in the city of Richmond, just in the city versus a referendum in the region, how that would turn out as to whether those statues would be removed. Now, probably today's people would not be as close to the history of the Civil War as older folks, and a new generation is entitled to their own new heroes. And one can certainly understand why Black folks, or in the city of Richmond or elsewhere, would feel very uncomfortable at the presence of those statues. But unfortunately, the whole process and the way in which they're being taken down is somewhat bothersome. Uh, it just seemed like there wasn't as much debate in the public as there could have been about it, although some may disagree with that. And one can't help but wonder if when things are done the way they were done by our elected leaders and certain overly zealous protesters, when things are done the way they were done in the city of Richmond, and I'm sure in other places as well, where you deface monuments of people that are idolized and respected by a different portion of the community, whether or not what you are really doing in the long run is not encouraging harmony, but you're certainly inciting and likely to aggravate folks who have a different feeling towards the statues. I mean, after all, in a certain sense, what you're doing when you deface monuments and things of that nature is, in a sense, you're violating and insulting someone else's background, their ancestors, and their culture, or at least it can be perceived that way. So, in a lot of respects, if the goal is racial harmony, what in essence happens is that you've achieved just the opposite. In any event, at this point, we turn the page on the Civil War, and let's just hope that everybody remains calm. And thanks to everyone for joining us. We'll talk to you next time.